In this study, I'm going to paint a vivid and honest description of sin, of what we're really like. And it can be quite depressing. But I just give this at the beginning because I know that having given this study before, some have been quite depressed. And I say this and underline this, all our studies from now on, after this one, will be just building up and up. Because God does have an answer to our problem of sin. If we want to understand the power of forgiveness to effect change in our lives, then we've got to understand what sin is. And if we want to understand sin, then paradoxically we must understand who God is. Sin ultimately and intrinsically is against God. David committed adultery with Bathsheba, and then he arranged the death of her husband Uriah. But David said to Nathan, I have sinned against Yahweh. And to God himself, David said, against thee only have I sinned and done this evil in thy sight. Even sin against another person is only sin because God says it is sin. And so sin is only sin because God deems it such. Let's have a look at a very brief consideration of who God is in Deuteronomy chapter 32. Deuteronomy 32 and beginning at verse 3. Because I will publish the name of Yahweh, ascribe greatness unto our God. He is the rock. His work is perfect. For all his ways are judgment, just, righteous. He's a power of truth, and without iniquity, just and right is he. God is totally and infinitely perfect. He is totally righteous. He never does anything wrong. And righteousness, brothers and sisters and young people, underpins everything that God does. It's the foundation of his very character. God's love and his mercy are righteous. And God is the source and the arbiter of what's right and wrong. And he cannot tolerate anything that is not as he sees it. And he can't. He just absolutely can't. And that's the way it is because of who he is. So God is perfect. He's holy. He cannot accept anything that opposes himself. Just come with me to Exodus chapter 20. Here's the 10 Commandments. And the very first of the 10 Commandments. Here's the introduction, as it were, to those commandments. And he says in Exodus chapter 20, verse 3, Thou shalt have no other gods before me. And the word before is panim. It means before my face. In other words, in my presence. In other words, I cannot have any other God or power in my presence. I am to be the only power. He cannot share his role, nor can he be usurped. And so God is perfect and holy. He cannot accept anything that opposes himself or his will, even slightly. It's a case, brothers and sisters and young people, of acceptance of God or nothing. And God's will, as far as he is concerned, there is no room for anything else. And that's the God who created us. And that's what God had in mind when he made us. When God made man and woman, he designed us for perfection, to be like him. He wanted to fill and wants to fill this earth with his glory, with himself. So how did he make us? These are first principles. Come with me to Genesis chapter 1 and verse 26. And God said, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness." That's all we need at this stage. Let us make God after our image and after our likeness. This is Elpis Israel, isn't it? He made us to be in his image, in his outward form, his shape, as it were. And he made us to have a mental capacity that is like his, to think spiritually. Therefore, what that's saying to us is that he made us to both look like him and to think like him. Therefore, to act like him. Now, he gave our first parents other attributes as well. There are many of those, but these are those that the divine record highlights. He gave us free will. He gave us desires. And he gave us the sense of wholeness, of security and well-being. We'll see this as we go on. And first of all, he gave our first parents a free will. And that free will enabled Adam and Eve to think independently. He gave them the choice to accept his will or their own. And he gave our parents, our first parents, desires. And these were legitimate desires. It's the word that is often translated or rendered lusts. But actually the word simply means desires. And they were legitimate desires because God made our first parents with these desires. And he himself said of these creatures that they are very good in chapter 1, verse 31. It wasn't until the serpent beguiled Eve that these desires became what Paul describes as deceitful lusts or deceitful desires. So what were these desires? Well, they're the same three things that we list out often. And of course, John is speaking of the lusts of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life after the fall. But those same were desires before the fall. But they were legitimate. So there was the desire of the flesh, the desire of the eyes, and there was a desire for worth. And so these legitimate desires were legitimate while they were under the control or the motivation of God's will. And these desires created in our first parents can also be seen like this. The desire of the flesh speaks of physical desires, the physical needs, the need to eat or drink, to protect or to preserve. And the desire of the eyes, humans were created with the ability to see, even in our imaginations. It's something that animals don't have. To visualize, to set goals, to picture things in our mind's eye. And God intended humans to extend the beauty of the garden throughout the earth and to subdue it. And to do this would have meant the ability to create. He gave them this ability for creativity, resourcefulness, a vision of what was beautiful and what could be accomplished. Adam was to be inspired by the beauty of the garden which God had made. And he also gave them desires for worth, self-worth, to see the labour of our hands and to find pleasure in such things. Adam was placed in the garden to dress and to keep it, to show his own creativity and to accomplish things. And God gave Adam dominion over the lower creation, and he gave him the task of naming those animals. He gave him purpose. It wasn't for his self-glory. It was that he was to have satisfaction in what God had given him to do. And before the fall, Adam and Eve felt no inhibitions. They could stand in the presence of the angels without fear, something that their children and they after the fall could not feel that they could do. Adam and Eve before the fall were one with God. They felt loved by God. They felt cared for. Their self-worth was derived from God, who made them to reflect him and to accomplish his will in the earth. These desires, brothers and sisters, were to reflect God's desires in man. None of these desires were wrong, and until the serpent suggested otherwise, the thought of desiring things unbidden or forbidden by God never entered their heads. Now, the third thing that we were to look at was this idea of well-being. Let's have a look at Genesis 2 and verse 25. It says there, and they were both naked, the man and his wife, and were not ashamed. They were naked and they could stand in the presence of each other and the angels without feeling self-conscious. They were like naive children. There were no inhibitions. They felt no shame. They felt secure in a sense of well-being. They were one with God. They were one with each other. They were one with themselves. Nothing stood in their way. And all was designed for the accomplishing of God's purpose. You see, God's will controlled, as it were, Adam's own free will. So that by choice, Adam controlled his desires in conformity with God's will. He never thought anything else but wanted that. And that resulted in the controlling of his desires. Therefore, it resulted in this uninhibited relationship with God and with his wife and the sense of well-being. There was no shame. As soon as they sinned, things were different. The serpent showed Eve a different way of looking at what God had commanded. She was completely sucked in by his reasoning. In Genesis 3 verse 6, and when the woman saw that the tree was good for food and that it was pleasant to the eyes and a tree desired to make one wise, she took of the fruit thereof and did eat and gave it also to her husband with her, and he did eat. Now she saw the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil through different eyes than those that she had viewed that fruit just moments before. Before, she had seen the fruit through God's eyes, through his will, as he had instructed Adam. Now she saw the fruit through her own desires that had been aroused by the serpent's view. These were the same desires as she had previously, but they were no longer governed by belief in what God had said unto Adam, but in belief in what an animal had told her. And that animal had it wrong. She saw the tree as being able to fulfill her illegal desire to eat of that desirable fruit. She saw the tree was pleasant to the eyes with a view to satisfying her own vision. She saw the tree was now able to give her an equality with the angels through an illegitimate means. She ate and gave it to her husband, who hearkened unto the voice of his wife, who had listened to the voice of an animal rather than the voice of God. Now things are different. The sin was like a trigger. Now they had a huge problem. It was a psychological problem. There was an awareness of things that they were not aware of before. They were looking at themselves, at each other, at God, at life in a different way. In verse 7, we read, "And the eyes of them both were opened, and they knew that they were naked. And they sewed fig leaves together and made themselves aprons." They were embarrassed by their nakedness, and they felt compelled to cover themselves with fig leaves. But that didn't solve the problem. The problem wasn't external, the problem was internal. And so in verses 7 to 10, it shows how they felt shame, they feared, and as a result, they felt the need to hide from God. Oh, things were different. Here's the birth of a guilty conscience and shame. This was their own immediate, natural reaction to their transgression of God's commandment. There's a raw, brutal, and stark contrast between what their minds were like before that fall and moments after it. It was just like that. And isn't it interesting, brothers and sisters, that almost immediately these new sinners, still inexperienced in sin's artful ways, they started to manifest some of the underlying traits of sin's self-centered thinking. When the Elohim calls him in verse 9, "Where art thou?" Adam responds still with the naivety, innocence of a child, by confessing his feelings exactly in verse 10. He says, "And he said, I heard thy voice in the garden, and I was afraid because I was naked and I hid myself." This was all an awkward new experience. But when confronted with the ominous truth behind the question in verse 11, "Who told thee that thou wast naked? Hast thou eaten of the tree whereof I commanded thee that thou shalt not eat?" Adam responds in verse 12, "The woman whom thou gavest to be with me, she gave me of the tree and I did eat." There's at least a tinge of self-justification here, isn't there? An excuse, a ducking for cover. Forms of self-protection, which would grow into the sophisticated forms we experience today. Here's the beginnings of neurosis, of psychosis, and psychopathological disorders, and all the these mental things that we feel today, of stresses and depression and so on. Now, what has happened? These things were the result of sin. God's will was no longer controlling Adam's own will. The self-will now gave choice and license to his desires. And the result? A guilty conscience and shame. And shame, brothers and sisters and young people, affects one's being like no other of all the emotions. Now, this is what sin brought. We know these. These are first principles. It brought mortality and all that goes with that. Tiredness, weakness, sickness, sorrow, suffering, aging, and death. It also brought this bias or proneness to sin and all that that brings. That constant battle. Knowing what we ought to do but not doing it, and not doing the things we ought to do, as Paul says in Romans. But there's another consequence of sin. We know, brothers and sisters, that mortality and bias to sin were passed on within human nature to Adam's offspring. But something more else was passed on. Adam and Eve had children who had children who had children who had children. And all of them sinned and came short of the glory of God, bringing with it that same psychological issues that were imposed upon that next generation. And it compounds and compounds so that we're all victims of sin and we are all sin's agents. We all pass it on. We all feed to our children what was fed to us. An environment of sin. We are begotten into an environment that is geared to sin. Right from children, we are fed with all sorts of things. From our parents, our siblings, our family, friends, schoolmates, workmates, people in the meeting, people in the world, all about us. Wherever the prince of the power of the air is, brothers and sisters, everywhere we are surrounded by, imposed upon, insinuated upon, and we live and move and have our being in a world that affects us. And the bias that we have within has a response to that. And together, we all sin and come short of the glory of God. And we all pass it on. So let's see what this means. The Bible is very clear in describing sin and its workings. The Word of God parades sin from one end of the book to the other. It's all about the conquering of the great enemy, sin. Is it not? From Genesis 3:15, there depicted is that great battle. Now let's look at how the Bible defines and describes sin and how it works. The Old Testament in particular is rich with words that describe sin. We understand that there are over 50 words for sin in the Old Testament. And they are very colourful words. And they have very expansive meanings. And each one tells a whole story about how sin works. Now, we don't have time to look at those words. I've looked at them all. And they are powerful. It's an amazingly descriptive way of sin. But all of those words are actually summed up in 3 words that are representative of sin in the Old Testament. These are they. They're found in the major passages that deal with sin. There's Chata and Pesha and Avon. Sin, transgression, and iniquity. Let's have a look at each of these words. Cheta. There are various derivatives of this word. There's chet, kata, and kata'a, and every one of them are translated usually sin, but not always. It has a wide range of meanings, but it essentially means to miss the mark. So what is that mark? The Theological Word Book makes this very interesting comment about this word. In so acting, man, in missing the goal or standard God has for him, is failing to observe the requirements of holy living, or falls short of spiritual wholeness. You see, God is the one who has set the rule, the standard, the law. And what is that rule or standard? Well, it's Him. He's the standard. He can accept nothing else. He cannot lower that standard. And He's written about those rules and those laws in His Word. What He wants of us, that's the standard. It's Him. It's His will. And He can accept no other. It's perfection. Anything that misses that standard has missed the mark. The second word is this word transgression, pesha. It's usually translated transgression, but it means rebellion. In other words, it's a deliberate setting out to commit a forbidden act, like David with Bathsheba. And the word iniquity, avon, means perversion. It's usually translated iniquity, but it means perversion. It's often used as a collective noun, describing many perversions all in one. In other words, or for example, the iniquity or the perversion, which means all the perversion summed up of the Amorites is not yet filled. And so we see that there's a progression here. It tells a story. First, we unintentionally miss the mark. And then we miss it again and again. And we then tend to feed upon sin to the extent that we become hardened. And we even rebel against Yahweh. And as we continue in this course, it ends in total perversion. And you know, that's our history, isn't it? That's the history of mankind. Down through the ages, the world is filled with a progression of missing the mark and rebellion and perversion, so that the whole environment is perverted like the Amorites, which is filling up for judgment. But the problem we have, brothers and sisters, with sin is we so often don't see it. It's not just a case of God is saying this or that is wrong. See there's sin, stamp it out quick and get rid of it. You can't see it. So that Paul in Hebrews chapter 3 and verse 13 calls it the deceitfulness of sin. Brother Carter makes this comment about the deceitfulness of sin. He says, but here is one of the dire consequences that comes with sin. That the more a man becomes familiar with it as performing and yielding himself to it, so he becomes less aware of the real character of sin. It is one of the most striking of the moral laws of God that the more a man knows of sin, the less he is aware of what it is. It's hideous. It's deceitful. It's pernicious. It's insinuating. It's pervasive. It's conniving. It disguises itself even as being righteous, and we pass it on. The Bible shows us very clearly what it's like. Let's have a look at this, brothers and sisters, and And perhaps we can do a little bit of self-examination as we go through. In James chapter 2 and verse 9. But if ye have respect of persons, ye commit sin. Do any of us have trouble with this? How do we react when our children have been criticised or hurt by someone? Are we truly fair in our judgment? When a friend sins, how do we consider their sin as opposed to someone with whom we don't get along with? With our friends, we're apt to consider all the extenuating circumstances. It's their background, it's their upbringing, it's this or it's that. We must show love and mercy. But if it's our enemy, this is disfellowship stuff. We ought to be using the sword of the Spirit and contend earnestly for the faith. Ever known a pecking order in how we deal with our brethren and with those with whom we have to do? It's respect of persons. It's in us. It's sin and it's death. James chapter 4 verse 17. To him that knoweth to do good and doeth it not, to him it is sin. We tend to concentrate on not doing the things that we know are wrong. But what about the things we ought to be doing but don't do it? That's sin. Preaching in season, out of season. When it's convenient, when it's not. Giving thanks for meals in front of the stranger. Not listening to gossip, but telling the person to go direct to the person they have a fault with. Or having heard the details of something a brother or sister has done, we should go and see them. And it goes further than that. In Romans 14, verse 23, for whatsoever is not of faith is sin. So what does that mean? It means that if we can't prove to ourselves that something we want to do is acceptable to God, we shouldn't do it. Otherwise, it's sin. In other words, we must have a good conscience about this towards God. So how do we find out if it's acceptable to God or not? Well, we've only got one way, and that's this book. If we can't find it there, if we can't prove that through the principles of God's word that it's acceptable to him, then if we go ahead, it's sin because it's not in faith. And clearly it means that we ought to have a good conscience about everything we do. We must feel honestly comfortable about whatever we do is acceptable to God. Well, all of these things we've considered so far are things we can see. Yes, these things are sinful things. We can see them, and so we can see them in others, and we can do something about those things. But there's another level. Christ, as he so often does, goes below the surface. Come with me to Matthew chapter 5. These are all standard passages, brothers and sisters. Matthew chapter 5. And in verse 27, ye have heard that it was said by them of old time, thou shalt not commit adultery. But I say unto you that whosoever looks on a woman to lust after her hath committed adultery with her already in his heart. This is not merely the act of sin. Here is secret sin, perhaps fleeting thoughts of sin. It could be any woman in the flesh, or a photograph in a magazine, or on a screen. The accidental touch, or a glance, a chance meeting, the sort of thing that can happen in a moment. But because it's not the very act, we excuse it. And if we're like the Pharisees, brothers and sisters, and we look at the word only on the surface legally, then we've got a problem. You see, God's word is there to teach us what humans are like, and its principles are far-reaching and should be applied at the deeper level below the surface. Not just the act, but we've got to go to the source of the act, our thinking. And to show that this is true, Christ shows us again in verse 21. He says, you have heard that it was said by them of old time, thou shalt not kill, and whosoever shall kill shall be in danger of the judgment. But I say unto you that whosoever is angry with his brother without a cause shall be in danger of the judgment. And whosoever shall say to his brother, Raca, shall be in danger of the council. But whosoever shall say, thou fool, shall be in danger of hellfire. The Apostle John says it simply this way in 1 John 3 verse 15, whosoever hates his brother is a murderer, and you know that no murderer hath eternal life abiding in him. Once again, it's not the act. It's not even the secret wish or thought. It's the motives that can eventuate in murder. It's even more than that. You see, Christ turns it on its head, and he gets us to assess the way we think. We've got to take the principle of the commandment and apply it to every strata of our lives, into the way we think. We say, well, I don't get on with my brother, but I'd never murder him. Well, Christ says, you belittle a brother. You call him worthless or useless, or perhaps that you wished he wasn't in our ecclesia, or even perhaps dare to say, I don't want him to be in the kingdom. That's character assassination. That's murder. If we think of our brother or our sister in that way. Actually, we've got a huge problem here, brothers and sisters. This takes sin down to the level of motive and the way we think. How do we analyze those, our motives? The Apostle Paul said this, but with me it is a small thing that I should be judged of you or of man's judgment. Yea, I judge not mine own self. Now Paul says, I don't care that you judge me. It doesn't mean much. I don't even judge myself. Why? Because in the end, he can't be even sure of his motives. He can't be sure of them exactly. That's not to say that we shouldn't examine ourselves. We spent a whole session on that. Of course we must. But we've seen how hard it is. Paul says, I will not even judge my own self in the end, because I don't know whether it was right or wrong what I did. You know, brothers and sisters, that's not even the half of it, because most of the time we don't even realize we've sinned. For example, we could be doing something for a widow. And we're doing this thing privately. And our motive is good. It's all well-intentioned. And we happen to notice a brother drive by as we were doing this deed. And there's this fleeting moment of pride. We feel a sense of good wash over us, and then it's gone. And we carry on. We may not have even noticed it. It's all done in a moment. All it did was make us feel good. But we've sinned. It's so subtle. And you think the number of those fleeting moments that happen in just one day. Most of the time, we don't notice them. The castaway comment, the put down, the impatient or irritated comment to our child when we're busy concentrating on something else, maybe even Bible study. In our sense of self-importance. And what does that teach our child? The careless or heartless comment that stings the listener. The feeling of injustice and hurt from someone else's comment to us. I'm worthy of more respect than that. The sense of self-importance in our job. The sense of superiority because of position or some skill that we may have when someone pays us a compliment. The sneaky practice, the white lie to get out of some sticky situation. And all of these things happen so fast, so frequently that we don't even notice them. They're part of our lives and they're sin. Now, how bad is this? Most of what we do, brothers and sisters, is by habit. And continual sins committed, even fleetingly, become habits. And that's why it seems as if we're doing it without thinking. Habit drives the thought into the subconscious, and it becomes part of us, our very character. So let's go deeper. Let's just see how hideously diseased our nature is. Here's those three lusts. The three basic desires are still there, embedded in our nature, and we need fulfillment in physical things. We aspire to have things, or have things, which really is covetousness. We derive our self-worth by our achievements and possessions in the course of this life. And it's all fed from a nature that's bent against the will of God and bent towards self-fulfillment. Remember what God wanted? His will is in control of our free will, and therefore it controls our desires to His will, and that gave a sense of well-being. It produced that. But God is no longer in control. God's will was thrust aside. Man is in control of his own desires now. See what the problem is? It's self. Self rules. Self is the beam that's in our eye, the light of the body, the being. The problem is self-centeredness. And when we look at the three lusts, brothers and sisters, there's one governing factor. It's self. Self-will is in control. And self now governs the desires, so that it no longer needs, but it wants, yea, it demands self-fulfillment. And that's what Eve did. She saw things from her own point of view, and a self-will or self-desire, not the desire towards God's will. It's self-centeredness. Isn't that true? Didn't Paul say this in Romans 7? I had not known sin but by the law. For I had not known lust except the law had said, thou shalt not covet. But sin, taking occasion by the commandment, wrought in me all manner of concupiscence. For without the law, sin was dead. What's the problem? The law said, thou shalt not covet. And I said, but I want it. Only because it's there and I'm told I'm not allowed it. But I want it. The self wants it. The self doesn't like being told what to do. It wants control. And human nature is such that despite knowing God's grace in Christ, not only do we know all the theory behind the problems of sin, brothers and sisters, and we know that God has provided in his grace, his salvation in Christ. We know that. We still want to do it ourselves. We want to be in control of our own salvation. We don't want to lose control to God. We want to control God. The most obvious example of this, of course, is legalism. That's what we call self-righteousness. But it's not merely the hardline Judaizer that we're talking about here. It's also the liberal. The one wants to step way away from the line in case I break that commandment. The other wants to get way over the line. He's on the other side of the line and he's hanging on by a fingernail. I'm still keeping the law. It's all legalism. That's not faith. And whatsoever is not of faith is sin. On the other end of the scale, you've got idolatry. We want God to be like some pocket good luck charm that we hang about our necks. The Catholics do that, don't they? They hang things around their necks. A genie in the bottle. At our beck and call. If God does what we want, he's answered our prayers. If he doesn't do what we want, then he hasn't answered our prayers. He's left us. He's forsaken us. Really? Blessings are when God gives us what we want. Cursing is when he hasn't given us what we want. Alternatively, brothers and sisters, we can also see there's another kind of approach where we see ourselves as so unworthy, so unimportant. We see ourselves as a victim. And everyone else must run around after us because I'm in such a state. You see, we've still got control. The issue is, with all of this, that we're trying to deal with the problems that we face ourselves. We want control. We want to fix the problems, the pains, the hurts, the things that have gone wrong in our lives. The situations and circumstances of our lives that are not good, that affect the way we think. We want to have it the way we want it. We've got the picture of what we would like. And our environments feed on this problem, and we feed it. We are the victims and the agents of sin. the aching womb for a child. That's not wrong, is it? Of course it's not wrong. But look at what it can cause. Impatience, anger, bitterness, spite, envy, jealousy, dissatisfaction. The distress brought by a wayward child can bring rash promises, reactive outbursts against comments, self-justification, blaming of others, even the ecclesia, the rules, the Bible study, or anything, because our child has gone down a wrong path. The hurt from the revelation that your child has been abused can produce bitterness, anger, blaming of God, blaming of the word, and even self-blame. Or we don't have the income that allows us to get ahead in life. All we want is enough to feed our family. That's not wrong. But the worries, the stress, the anxiety, the arguments, the wishing, which we all legitimize. But that's not trusting in God. That's not faith. And whatsoever is not of faith is sin. We're in desperate straits, aren't we, brothers and sisters? And life seems so unfair. The unmarried brother or sister desperately seeks the one thing that will give them happiness and fulfillment in life. A partner in life. It can lead to all kinds of behaviours, brothers and sisters, and practices. People travel the world, obsessed, seeking their happiness, preoccupied, distractions, and obsessed, often at the expense of the truth. In fact, brothers and sisters, the ecclesia becomes merely a vehicle for that which obsesses. Bitterness, jealousy, envy, covetousness. And all of these things we justify, and we understand why. We don't blame ourselves or others for feeling this way, because it's so understandable. But it's all sin. And we mess up our lives. And we bring all these things with us, and we superimpose them onto our children. And they too pass it on. Perhaps not in the same form. Perhaps they've recognized that problem, so we're going to do it our way. And so it's all about self saying, I'm going to not be like them. I'm going to do it this way. Or I'm going to just do it like them because, well, if they did it, I'll do it. And it's all me and I. It has nothing to do with God, who is the only one that can fulfill our needs, our vision, and our self-worth. And we can go deeper. And who wants to go deeper? And this can be very depressing. And I remind you, there is an answer to all of this. It hurts. It's ugly. No one wants to look at ourselves at this level because we're protective of ourselves. What are we protecting? Ourselves. We are hiding from what we really are. We want to be seen by others and by ourselves as being good and right. Oh, we recognize our failings. Okay, but we will only go so far. We want to be seen as good and right, but we're not right. We're far from it. We don't want to be seen and be made even more insecure and more vulnerable. And yet that's the condition and recognition that God wants and can deal with us when we recognize that vulnerability. You know, sin even shapes our very personalities, our characters. For example, brother tell it all but not listen. We all know the sort of person who wants constantly to tell you. He's not listening to what you say. He's only interested in telling you what he knows. He's only concerned about his own knowledge or opinion. And the frustration of not being a part of the conversation. You're just a sounding board. The problem with self is rather obvious with brother tell it all but not listen. But what about you, the listener? The feeling of frustration is often the desire for self to be recognized. Hey, I'm here. Both of these can become personality traits. And they are sin-driven because they are serving self. What about Sister Obsequious? You know, some people are wonderful servants in the ecclesia. They're always serving. And we hold them up as wonderful examples of selfless service. This could be very true. I'm not denying that fact. And what I'm about to describe is not always the case, but I want you to consider this. It's a question of motive, isn't it? It could be from a selfless, God-honoring motive. Or is it part of their character to serve? And is it part of a character that was formed from past events in their lives that had nothing to do with God? They're driven to serve. It's part of them. What caused that? Is it a need to be always giving and serving to prove our own self-worth? That I am worth something? As I say, this is not necessarily the case, but it can often be the underlying motive, and we don't see it. And that sister, Obsequious, objectifies her brothers and sisters to fulfill her need. Because perhaps when she was a child, she was always criticized for being useless. Or the things that she'd always been criticized for not doing things, or whatever it is at school. Whatever it is, brothers and sisters, it can shape our characters. I can tell you, brothers and sisters, the things that shape the way I think now. What happened in my home, what happened at school, what my friends, my supposed friends, did to me. It absolutely shapes the way I think. I have almost an obsession with sincerity and honesty because of what happened. I can tell you the incidents that helped shape that in me. That's not come from God. That's been shaped by sin. My inadequacies, my insecurities, my need for sincerity to be shown to me. I hope that I'm sincere for the right motives. But with Paul, I don't know. Can you see the problem we've got, brothers and sisters? And we've all got this kind of thing. It's at the core of our being. We are all affected by our environment in some way, the way we were brought up or whatever it is. It's been imposed, it affects us, it creates all sorts of insecurities. I'm yet to find the person that hasn't got insecurities. Even the most dynamic and in-control person has got insecurities. That's part of their insecurity, is that they want to be seen as self-control. They want to feel in control. For example, Brother Expert is considered to be well read. Someone asks him if he's read the latest book by a certain author, to which he responds, yes, or at least indicates yes. But he hasn't. He lies. Why? Because he's trying to protect the reputation he feels he has. He feels shame at not having read that book. He tries to cover it. Why should he feel shame? Because he's built up this protective estimation of who he is in the eyes of others. The sin has corrupted, brothers and sisters, everything that God intended from the beginning. It's all skew whiff now. It's all motivated out of self and the desire for control. And shame produces hideous outcomes. Brother or sister sensitive, you know, the ones that can't take criticism. None of us like criticism, but we all know that constructive criticism can be helpful to improve us. But brother and sister sensitive can't accept criticism at all, full stop. It's always taken as an attack against their whole self, their whole self-worth. Not the thing that they've done. Their whole self is shamed. Here's an illustration. Husband, darling, why don't you give us mashed potatoes instead of whole boiled potatoes tonight? I know you don't like my cooking. He never said that. But because she was criticized, her whole self has been shamed. Now, you know, brothers and sisters, we can all do that, can't we? Brother or sister perfectionist, hands up, self-confessed. Some people are very gifted, aren't they? Some have an aptitude to certain things, or they have developed the skills. It's perhaps natural, or they have spent the time to develop those skills. And they get it right because of those skills or because of their natural ability. But perfectionists do it for another reason. They've got to get it right. It's an obsession. They'll stick at it until they get it right, no matter how long and at what cost. Why? Well, we can clothe the reason in such expressions as striving for excellence, or doing the best that we can, or doing it for Christ's sake. But the motive of the perfectionist, brothers and sisters, is nothing like that. They've got to have it right for their self-worth. Usually it's protecting a deep-seated insecurity about having not accomplished something, or always being criticized, or not meeting expectations of parents or peers or those in authority. It's sin-motivated. It's part of their personality. Sin is very deep, isn't it, brothers and sisters? Or what about our sister, happy disposition? She's always laughing, enjoys a joke, always cheerful, no matter what. And this sort of person always sees good in other people or in circumstances. You never see them unhappy. They don't like to hear or talk about unhappiness. Always joyful in the Lord. And we're really envious. But it's not always as it seems. What drives the happiness? Of course, there are brothers and sisters who are genuinely thankful and are motivated by the truth. So I don't discount that at all. And nor am I trying to attribute your personal motive. You're the ones that have to assess yourself and see what you do. Often, brothers and sisters, when you get behind the facade, because that what it is, they're hiding a deep hurt, an unhappy experience, guilt or shame in their lives. And this is their protective way of getting rid of the issue. They shroud themselves in a world that's happy. It's self-driven and it's self-trying to control. It's a sin-driven personality. Or Sister Proud Mum. She's at a piano recital. Seen this picture before? And the child makes a mistake. And she feels ashamed, angry, embarrassed. Well, he's played it 1,000 times better than that. Or, I don't know how this could have happened. Or, he's not practicing enough. And the child gets a right royal telling off for embarrassing you. How could that be? Where does that shame come from? Not the child, but what is it teaching and imposing on the child? What is being fed into that child about expectations? And what is it that pleases? And what is it that's going to give these unpleasant experiences? And so it goes on, and we feed, and it is passed on. I'll show you where it comes from, brothers and sisters. Here's the underlying issue in Genesis 3 and in verse 7. Genesis 3 verse 7. And the eyes of them both were opened, and they knew that they were naked. And they sewed fig leaves together and made themselves aprons. You see, when self is in control, brothers and sisters, of our desires, of our will, and therefore our desires, it brings shame. And shame affects us like nothing else. It plagues us. It insinuates itself in our personalities. And you know, it's interesting that medical scientists and psychologists and researchers have only just started coming to realize the problem of shame as being probably the greatest influencer of the human psyche. As one researcher commented, he says, to understand shame, in some sense, is to understand human nature. Brother Thomas said this in Opus Israel. Adam and Eve vainly imagined that they could cover their own sins and efface it from divine scrutiny. But the very clumsy device that they contrived betrayed the defilement of their consciences. Their posterity have not learned wisdom by the failure of their endeavour. But to this day, they are industriously engaged in inventing cloaks for their evil consciences, as were their first parents when stitching fig leaves together to cover their shame. All efforts to overcome by our own endeavours are futile. Each endeavour only increases our problem. And looking at all this, brothers and sisters, we can see our hopelessness. It's impossible. As Romans chapter 8 and verse 20 to 22 says, "For the creature was made subject to vanity, not willingly, but by reason of him who hath subjected the same in hope, because the creature itself also shall be delivered from the bondage of corruption into the glorious liberty of the children of God. For we know that the whole creation groans and travails in pain together until now." It's full of pain. It's full of anguish and trouble and sorrows and worlds that are turned upside down and chaos, families split, chaos and trouble and anguish everywhere. The carpet seems to be pulled out of our perfect world as time goes by in our lives. All flesh is grass. We're all in this together, brothers and sisters. We're all in the same boat. Even the flower of grass, those that have been endowed with apparent beauty or position, those that stand out, they too wither and die just like the grass. The hills and the mountains are brought low, and the valleys are lifted up, and they're on one plane. Who can feel confident, brothers and sisters, when we assess ourselves after what we've seen, feel confident in judging another person? We are in the same boat. Who can see past the beam in our own eye to find the mote, the splinter in our brother's eye? When Christ said those words to his disciples after they said, "Who then can be saved?" With men, he says, it is impossible. Can we see that, brothers and sisters? It is impossible. Paul could not judge his own motives, and nor can we. We don't know what our motives are. It's such a mixture of things. We may be doing something right. I believe, brothers and sisters, that in our motives, we may do something that is considered by God as being righteous at the very same time that we've got some conflicting thought. It is so mixed up. We can't get control of this. And when Christ came into the world, it was a world that was prepared. There was a lot of people in desperate need. The poor, the fatherless, the widows, the beggars, the sick, the blind, the lame, the naked, the withered hands, the mad. Those cast outside the camp, the lepers, those with issues, the eunuchs, the Gentiles, the lost, the publicans, the sinners, the harlots, the thieves, the mercenaries. These are the ones that he came to. These are the ones that responded because they knew that they had need. Life told them that. They understood that. But there was another group there who could not see their need, because they never looked below the surface of the Word of God and what it requires and their own nature. Let's not be like them, brothers and sisters. Let's look below the surface, and we'll see we are desperately, you are desperately in need, just as much as I am. And Christ cried out to all, "Come unto me, all ye that labour and heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn of me, for I am meek and lowly in heart. And you shall find rest unto your souls."